Joining us now, former New Jersey governor, 2016 Republican presidential candidate, and Trump transition chair, Chris Christie. His new memoir is entitled Let Me Finish: Trump, the Kushners, Bannon, Jersey, and the Power of In-Your-Face Politics. It's a New York Times bestseller, and I still think he stole my title. But anyhow, Governor Christie, good to have you on the show this morning. I have a million questions. Yeah, good to have you back. Why did Donald Trump hire Michael Cohen as his attorney?
It beats me.
You know?
Beats me. Listen, I never could quite understand the relationship. I think the president probably has a difficult time understanding it now. Cohen was not someone that I interacted with almost at all, Mika, and that wasn't by accident.
Hey, Governor, over the weekend, I'm sure you're aware, the president spoke to the Conservative Political Action Committee. Might still be speaking, but I think the speech ended after 2 hours. Among many extraordinary things that happened at the speech was the president's performance in and of itself. I don't know whether you've seen any.
I saw parts of it.
But one of the things that occurred during the convention was that the death of John McCain was literally the announcement that he was dead and had been dead, which everybody knew, but they announced it in terms of a political thing, received a standing ovation from parts of the crowd assembled. So the question is that your political party?
No, that's not people that I would agree with. But, Mike, there's always been elements of my party that I haven't agreed with, right? I mean, that's just, and I think that's normal for any political party. I'm sure there are folks who have heard some of the things that, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are saying that are mainstream Democrats who say, like, no, that's not the party that I belong to, even though that may be where the energy is right now in the Democratic Party. So I try not to I speak my disagreements. I disagree with that. I think it's horribly disrespectful. The same way that I said I disagreed when the president, as a candidate, said that John McCain wasn't a war hero. Right. So, you have to stand up and say when you disagree. That doesn't make you not a Republican anymore. That's not the way I view it. Party has lots of different elements to it. You agree with the parts that you agree with. It's like being a cafeteria Catholic, Mike.
But Governor Joe Scarborough here, aren't we in a different place than we've been? I can't recall a time where a convention of Democrats stood and gave a standing ovation when the announcement of George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan or Barry Goldwater or Dwight Eisenhower was announced. This is a new place. This is a deeply disturbing place that this part of the party's in, isn't it?
Well, listen, I think that both parties, Joe, are in some disturbing times.
Both parties. But both parties. Name me a time when Democrats at a convention have stood and cheered the death of a Republican.
Well, what I'd have to think about is whether they ever stood and cheered the death of a Democrat, because that's the analogy. The analogy is that they're cheering the death of one of their own. I can't think of one off the top. Right? But I can't think off the top of my head, Joe, of an example like that. But my point to you is broader, which is that is indicative of the fact that things are very different than when I first started coming on this program. When I first started coming on this program, I was being cheered by folks of both parties for working with both sides.
But it's different because of Donald Trump, is it not? I mean, even when Republicans and Democrats didn't get along, and that has been going on a long time, you still didn't have people cheering the death of a political figure who crossed their dear leader.
No, but I do think that the president's contributed to that. But I think that his election, in part, was a reaction to that divisiveness that already existed. If you go back, Joe, to I think this all started during the Clinton impeachment in the late 90s, when some very harsh lines were drawn between both parties. It continued on. I remember sitting at George W. Bush's inaugural in 2001 and having people standing up and screaming that he was not the president of the United States, that he was an illegitimate president. That moved into Barack Obama and the ridiculousness of the birtherism movement and what went on there. So I think this has been going on for a long time and increasing in intensity. And you know from covering our primary in 2016, it was a very difficult place for a lot of us to try to figure out and navigate. Because even me, who was, I think, a very direct, blunt person and was known that way, was seen as not tough enough in the times that we were talking about then. So I wouldn't say this is something that just happened in the last 2 years, Joe. This is something that I think has been happening over the last 20 years, progressively, since the Clinton impeachment.
So let me ask, and I don't want to belabor this point. I just want to be very clear here. Do you consider John McCain to be an American hero, to be a war hero,
without
to be
question.
somebody
Who
deserves this? Who deserves
you don't even have to go
standing
further.
ovation?
You don't have to go any further.
A great man,
I believe that John McCain,
a great American hero,
an American hero, somebody who's in the Hanoi Hilton for 6.5 years, wouldn't leave early despite the fact that he had the opportunity to, given the status of his family, put his men first and his country first. And I didn't always agree with Senator McCain on issues, but put that aside, the guy was a sterling example of what it means to be a patriot. And I have never questioned that, and I will never question that. The same way no one should have ever questioned the toughness of George H.W. Bush. Yet we had the wimp factor for a guy who was shot down in World War II and survived. We've had some really awful, divisive stuff. The same way, by the way, no one should have ever questioned whether Barack Obama was born in this country or not.
Right, which is what Trump did. President Trump did that.
Yeah, well, I disagreed with it then. I disagree with it now.
So federal prosecutors in New York and D.C. believe Michael Cohen was credible. Trump and his team at the White House and a lot of Republicans say he's not. What do you think?
Well, listen, I don't believe he's credible. I believe he's credible only if he's corroborated. And unlike a lot of the people who talk about this stuff, Mika, as you know, I actually had to do it for 7 years. And I put a lot of people on the stand who were serial liars. But that's what you deal with when you're dealing in criminal cases. And so what you need to do is make sure you corroborate those people. So I think that Michael Cohen will only be an effective witness to the extent he's independently corroborated either by other testimony, meaning verbal testimony, or by documents, or both, because he's got an awful history. Now, that doesn't mean that everything he says is a lie, but what it does mean is that you have to corroborate him. And I think any prosecutor, and certainly someone as careful, as skilled, and as objective as Bob Mueller, would never use someone like Michael Cohen unless he could corroborate them. And I think in general the same thing about the folks at the Southern District.
So as a former federal prosecutor and just with your legal knowledge, how easy would it be to corroborate the checks that he brought to the table? How easy would it be to prove that the president committed a campaign finance violation while in office?
Well, the question,
especially when you can follow the money.
Well, the question is the motivation for the money, Mika, as you know. And this goes back to
pay off a porn star to not speak about their affair.
Well, that's right. Now, what's the motivation for that? Because one of them is a potential crime and one of them isn't. So if, in fact, the motivation was to keep that information from folks in order to impact an election, that was the motivation for authorizing it, that's a potential crime. If it is otherwise, to say, no, I want to keep this for my wife and my family, that's not a crime. Right. And so, you know, here's the problem as a prosecutor. Let's say you believe Michael Cohen. Hold on, Joe. Let's say you believe Michael Cohen. Let's say you're the prosecutor and you believe him.
Tell me now?
Yeah, let me finish, Joe. So here's the thing. Let's say you believe Michael Cohen.
The bug sales. Go ahead.
What you have to do is you have to be able to take his testimony as a whole. I thought it was one of the positive things that happened for the president during Cohen's testimony was Cohen himself said, no, one of the motivations was to keep this from Mrs. Trump. And in fact, I lied to Mrs. Trump about the purpose for this. Now, that means your star witness is now providing two different reasons for the payment. There can be two different reasons for a payment, but the problem for them is going to be, and against any case against the president, ultimately, the president's going to be saying, I suspect, there was one reason for the payment, and that was to keep it from my wife. Prosecutors, I used to say to my prosecutors all the time.
I'll let you finish. Let me start.
I mean, given the time.
This happened. I mean, come on now. If you were prosecutor, governor, you would say, hold on a second. Let me get this straight. This affair happened when? 2005, 2006. Right. It happened a decade before Donald Trump was running for president. And yet this hush money payment happened A decade later, after the affair, right before a presidential campaign was coming to an end,
except, Joe,
you would consider that to be a bit of a smoking gun.
No, except, Joe, that's when she threatened to go public. And so you don't, my guess is, never having been involved in this myself personally, I'm just supposing that, that's when you decide I got to pay the money. It's when someone actually threatens you, not beforehand. So that's when the threat comes. And since the affair allegedly occurred, whether it was 10 years ago or not, it was during the time that he was married to the current First Lady. I think he's got a motivation on that side to keep that quiet. I don't want to evaluate which one is true at the moment because I don't know. But I'll tell you this as a prosecutor. If you're going to prosecute someone as high profile as the President of the United States, I used to say to my guys all the time, you want me to do something high profile like that? It better be a headshot. And what I'm telling you is that Michael Cohen's testimony did not provide a headshot on this because he himself said there were two reasons and that he acted on the Melania Trump reason by himself affirmatively lying to her about the purpose of the payment. So, that makes
Governor,
it
let me ask
different.
you a question.
Yeah.
If you had hidden a payment a week before either one of your two gubernatorial runs in New Jersey, or if I had it before any one of my four runs for Congress, tell me, what jail would they put you in? Because they would probably send me up to a penitentiary in Atlanta.
Well, as we know, there would have been 1 hour, 2 hour specials on CNN and MSNBC about it. We've already had that test case with me. But secondly, and then I didn't have to go to jail because I didn't do anything wrong. But the special still ran.
No.
The other part, in terms of the prison, I'd be looking to go to Connecticut, Joe. I like Connecticut as a place to go to jail if I had the option.
Well, let me tell you something. If you had done this, if I had done this, if Kevin McCarthy had done this, if anybody in Congress had done this, they would be convicted of a federal crime. And it does seem that Donald Trump is living by a different standard than every other politician that I've known.
I don't necessarily doubt what you're saying, except to this extent. John Edwards wasn't. I mean, John Edwards did this, and he wasn't. In fact, he was acquitted. And so these are tough cases. I'm talking about it now as a prosecutor. I'm trying to stay out of the politics of it for the moment, just for the sake of this conversation, because I think it's an important conversation. John Edwards' case proved how tough these cases are to prove when the defendant is giving a different rationale than what may seem obvious in your supposition, right? So all I'm saying is, as a prosecutor, if you're going to go after a high-profile person, you better not swing and miss, because it makes a very loud noise.
I would suggest, I don't want us to get into a law school class discussion. I would suggest the facts in the John Edwards case were quite different than the facts in Donald Trump's case.
Let's go to law school one time and debate it. I'd love that, me and you, Joe. It'd be fun.
That would be great. That would be great. So let's just ask a general question. I know you've been asked before. Let's see what your opinion is in early March 2019. Does Donald Trump face a greater legal jeopardy coming from the Mueller investigation or from the Southern District of New York and all the investigations that are sprawling down there?
I will be one of the few people who come on your show who has remained completely consistent for the last 9 months. Bob Mueller is not nearly the threat to the president and those around him that the Southern District is, for 3 reasons. Number one, there's no restriction on what the Southern District can look at. Bob Mueller has restrictions on what he can look at. Number 2 is Michael Cohen. Number 3 is Rick Gates. Because the Southern District of New York has both Rick Gates and Michael Cohen as tour guides through the Trump financial world, the Trump personal world, and the Trump inaugural world. Those are all things that would concern me and makes the Southern District investigation much more perilous, and in my mind has always made it much more interesting from a legal perspective than anything going on with Bob Mueller.
By the way, I know you have to find it as amusing as I do when people act like the Mueller report coming out and being dropped is going to be the end of everything. That's the end of spring training. Like, baseball season starts when the Southern District of New York and other prosecutors around America digest all the things that Bob Mueller has unearthed and then decide whether to prosecute or not, right?
Well, yeah, and by the way, they're not waiting for Bob Mueller. they've been working for a long time already on their own on a whole bunch of different avenues of pursuit. And so, like, listen, this is part of the problem with what the president's people and the president himself confront here, is there are a whole bunch of unknowables. And Joe, having been in a lot of campaigns yourself, you like to limit the number of unknowables as a candidate and as a strategist. But in this instance, there's a lot of unknowables. And the thing I used to say when I was U.S. attorney, the thing I loved about the job the most was only I knew what I knew. Right. And Bob Mueller's been very good at it. Let's hope the Southern District doesn't leak like it normally does. Let's hope that it keeps itself disciplined on this, because that's an important part of the prosecutorial toolkit, and also part of what we're supposed to be doing in a constitutional form of government is to protect people's reputations unless and until we have the evidence to bring a case to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But Bob Mueller, by the way, has shown his integrity in this investigation by not leaking. And he's been outstanding in that regard.
All right, we're going to have more with Chris Christie.
We're going to let him finish.
On the other side of the break, we're going to
Mika.
let him finish. Now available at your independent bookstores and at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, everywhere. Also, I'm going to be asking the governor his take on Jared Kushner's security clearance and on John Kelly's grave concern about him getting a security clearance. I'm also going to be asking him, along with the rest of our panel, actually I might let the rest of the panel ask him some questions. I know they want to get a chance. I'm going to ask which child of Donald Trump is in the greatest legal jeopardy going forward. We'll be right back. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.